Hello, everyone. Welcome. I see folks just able to enter the webinar now and piling in, so we will wait 1 minute before we officially get the ball rolling here. But welcome, welcome. This is great. We have a really robust group joining us today for this program. I'll quickly introduce the program today and get us started. My name is Kelly Humberkhauser. I am the Director of Government Relations at Main Street America. And you're here for the Main Street Advocacy Program for the Historic Tax Credit. And we're so pleased that you are able to participate with us. So just getting us started with a little bit of what we're going to cover today. We'll have some welcome remarks. We'll cover kind of where we're at right now with the historic tax credit, what these enhancements for the historic tax credit mean. And then we'll talk about what you can do to support the historic tax credit from your position in your communities. And we'll have plenty of time at the end of this program for Q&A. I really think this is an excellent opportunity for you all out there. You've been receiving messages about supporting the historic tax credit. You obviously got here based on your interest to do so, but we're very interested to know whether or not you have taken action yet, and then how we can support you. And of course, we welcome any questions that you have to help clarify how you can best make the case for the historic tax credit to your Senate offices. Today, we have with us Patrice Fry. She's the president and CEO of Main Street America, here to give us some opening remarks and help us understand the value of the historic tax credit. And then we'll also be hearing from Shaw Sprague, Vice President of Government Relations at the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and Mike Phillips, Director of Public Policy at the National Trust Community Investment Corporation. Both Mike and Shaw are experts in this historic tax credit arena and have been engaged in the entire process of the enhancements over time and can tell us more specifically about what the opportunity means for us, both in Main Street and the preservation world at this moment. Before we jump into Patrice's opening remarks, though, I do want to start us off with a quick poll. We are super curious about all of you and what actions you might have taken in order to support the historic tax credit. So you should see that poll appeared on your screen currently. The question is, have you already taken an advocacy action in support of the historic tax credit in the past month? We're interested to find out where our audience is in terms of outreach, so that we can better assist you. And wonderful, so much participation. We're up to 70% of participants in the poll, so fantastic. Keep popping them in, and then we will make sure to talk about those results for just a second before we move forward. I'll move forward once we hit 80%, so we're just 1% away. Hard pot, oh, there we go, 80%. Okay, so the results of this is only a small portion of you have already called your senators. That's great. That means that we can spend some time prepping for those types of conversations. Many of you have sent letters. Many of you have signed petitions. A good majority of you have not yet taken those advocacy actions, but you're excited to do so. And you didn't have an option that said you weren't excited to do so, so we anticipate that you are. So now I'll turn it over to Patrice Fry, President and CEO of Main Street America, for some remarks.
Hi, good morning or good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you are. Thanks, Kelly, for pulling all this together, and to our legislative gurus, Shaw and Mike, for joining us today. Thank you for taking time out of your really busy day to join us for what I think is a really important webinar on the enhancements or the opportunities associated with the historic tax credit. So you probably know that Congress is working hard on developing an infrastructure package, and the largest really planned improvement and expansion of that tax credit, the historic tax credit, is currently part of that infrastructure package. And we are working very hard to make sure that that it indeed makes it all the way through the legislative process. So this is a package of improvements to the historic tax credit that would really benefit all kinds of projects, whether those are Main Street scale projects or larger rehab projects. And so really urging you, as you can probably already tell, key theme of today is reach out to your senator and share your support for this really important legislation. And you're going to hear more about how to do that and later on. But did just want to emphasize that, you know, we see so many projects on Main Street that have really benefited from this, from historic tax credits. One of our new favorite is the Merwin building here in Astoria, Oregon. If you haven't been to Astoria, Oregon, I'm based here in Seattle, and the Oregon coast and Astoria is just lovely. So I'm excited to go see this building. This is a building that was built, I think, in 1926. It was vacant for 30 years. It was a hotel at one point, and now is really majority affordable housing. It was converted to affordable housing. With about 1.5 million of historic tax credits. So just one example of the power that the HTC can have on Main Street. So that's enough for me. I just want to thank you again for making time. And Kelly, I will hand it back to you to get on with the show.
Well, thank you so much, Patrice, for your support and for your remarks. And now we will turn it over to one of the two policy experts we have with us, Shaw Sprague, to walk us through a little bit of what's happening currently.
Well, thank you, Kelly, and thanks everybody for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'll start out by noting that, again, not all that unusual, but again, we find ourselves at a pretty interesting time in Washington. We're seeing several dynamics at play as we hear about raising the debt ceiling and the infrastructure package. But what's really driving a lot of this is the midterm elections, which are looming large for many members of Congress. And we're seeing that play out because of the razor thin majorities in both the Senate and House. The Senate is 50-50 split. So on tie votes, it's the vice president that comes in to cast the deciding vote. And in the House, there's only a margin of 3 or 4 votes. So with such a thin majority, the power can shift pretty easily. Right now, it's under full Democrat control with the executive and legislative branches. And when that happens, often in the midterms, the party in power loses some of that. So on the Democrat side, this is a really important window to advance the president's agenda, to advance Democratic priorities on Capitol Hill. And so that's what you see happening with the infrastructure package. You've got a number of vulnerable moderate Democrats, particularly Senator Manchin in the Senate and Senator Sinema, but as well as a couple handfuls of moderate Democrats in the House, which are really splitting the Democratic Party on the infrastructure package and making it difficult to reach agreement there. So what we saw most recently is a pledge by Speaker Pelosi to bring the bipartisan so-called hard infrastructure bill to the House floor for a vote. That was based on a promise to bring both that hard infrastructure bill and this broader $3.5 trillion human infrastructure bill to the House floor, which wasn't possible given the split in the Democratic Party. So what we saw over the past few days was the need to delay that vote, which is now scheduled for October 31st, which gives the president, the Speaker Pelosi, and Senator Schumer another few weeks to try to reach the middle ground within the Democratic Party on this broader package. It really is sort of I think from the Democrat agenda, something really needs to happen, and I think something will happen. And over the past few days, we've started to see some of the positions softening a bit in terms of that $3.5 trillion number that was agreed to as part of the reconciliation process, coming down. I think we heard the president say yesterday or the day before that he sees the number between 1.9 and 2.3 trillion. And Senator Manchin didn't balk at that. So it does seem that the positions are softening a bit. So that I think is encouraging for what might be possible over these next 3 weeks. So what does this mean for historic preservation and the historic tax credit in particular? Let's see, could I just see that previous screen, Kelly, make sure I didn't miss anything? Yeah, okay, I think we covered that. So what this means is we are in the very fortunate position to have the Historic Tax Credit Growth and Opportunity Act provisions included in the Ways and Means Committee portion of that broader reconciliation package. It passed out of the committee, and it really is a pretty extraordinary moment for our efforts to improve the historic tax credit. We've been working on this, all of us have been working on this for so long, and to have these included in the House bill to the exclusion of many other tax priorities that just didn't make it in is, positions us very well for success going forward. The challenge is that that bill was drafted presuming that the reconciliation package would be 3.5 trillion. So now that we know it is not going to be that, the president has acknowledged that it will not be that, there will need to be ways to cut the cost of that bill. And so which priorities will stay, which priorities will go, is what will be determined over these next 3 weeks. There are multiple provisions that Mike will describe in more detail of the Historic Tax Credit Growth and Opportunity Act. And so, there will be pressure to reduce the size of those provisions. What we are in a position to do now is really raise the voice of preservation, make sure that our senators, which really are the primary focus, and that's, we're have the support in the House. What we're not sure of is how strong the support is in the Senate to keep those provisions. So that's why there's so much focus on the Senate, but the House is important too, and the end bargain, if you will. But right now, over the next few weeks, we do want to make sure that the senators are hearing from all of you about the impact that these changes would have on Main Street and how important they'll be to recover from the pandemic, but then have this enhanced tool going forward, which will truly have a pretty transformational impact for larger downtowns, smaller downtowns. These would be the most substantial changes to the historic tax credit in at least a generation. And we really are at this key moment where if the senators aren't hearing about this, if they think that their constituents will not care, or they'll be able to cut these provisions down without much pushback, they will. And so we do need to take advantage of this moment and get these messages out. So we do have, I think, what we can describe as a high watermark with the House provisions that are included in there. What we need to ensure is that we have a strong finish. And why don't I pause there and turn it over to Mike. I think there's one more slide, Kelly. This just describes some of what the opportunity before us. More credits, more value to those credits. There will be more buildings that would qualify for the credits. Nonprofits, community development organizations will have an easier time partnering with developers without so much transactional costs associated there, and just generally and aligning with affordable housing. So there's so many really substantial and impactful changes at stake here. So I will just give you that preview and then turn it over to Mike for a little bit more in depth of the provisions and then getting to what you can do now. And we look forward to answering any questions about big picture or the more detailed provisions of the enhancements.
Great, thank you, Shaw, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to everybody through Main Street. Main Street was very critical in the advocacy in 2017 to keep the credit alive, and that kind of paints a picture that since 1986, where the credit was put permanently in the code, we've been playing defense, and the market has been adjusting to IRS regulations that have come out. And so this is really a true opportunity to advance and modernize the historic tax credit since 1986. As you all will recall, in 2017, thanks to your great advocacy, we were able to save the credit from elimination, but it was spread out over 5 years. So there was a little bit of a haircut as far as the value of the credit when you consider time value of money of when the credits are released to a project. The provisions that Shaw outlined are very similar to the Historic Tax Credit Growth and Opportunity Act, which many of you have advocated on for many years. The provisions are almost identical to the House version of that bill, with the addition of a provision on public schools, which was a bill from Representative Evans in Philadelphia. So the provisions, there's 6 provisions, and one of them is temporary and 5 of them are permanent. And the temporary provisions is the newest provision, and that has come in response to the last 18 months. As you probably know, that historic rehab is typically riskier than new construction. You get a building and you sometimes don't know what you have when you pull back the walls and take a look, or you have a surprise environmental remediation that needs to be dealt with. And in turn, banks tend to lend less to these projects. And since the pandemic has happened, banks have become more risk averse. And where many banks have been clamoring to make loans to a lot of these projects, the competition is not what it was among banks to loans to these projects. Not only that, but there's been on-site issues and financing issues with these projects. Labor and materials have cost of materials have skyrocketed. You're also seeing in regards to materials, you have to use quality products for historic rehab. So those quality products have cost, and they have supply chain delays and that sort of thing. So the first provision addresses a lot of that. It would bring a temporary boost to the credit from 20% to 30% for 5 years. And then the credit would ramp down to 26% and 23% in the years afterwards. And this would be available to all projects. And the second provision is elimination of the basis adjustment, and this would be available to all projects as well. Right now, a building owner has to subtract the value of the credit from a building's basis. The basis is the value of the building for tax purposes. And this causes a few problems, both in the kind of tax policy wonky world when you are bringing in an investor, but also you're decreasing the amount of value according to the IRS of your building, and so you're restricting the benefits as far as depreciation and capital gains and other tax related areas. So this elimination would for the first of all would bring better pricing for tax credits, and it would also bring the credit in to be more compatible to affordable housing credits. Right now, affordable housing credits are calculated according to a building's basis, and with using the HTC, you're subtracting from the building's basis. So that doesn't make sense to do if you're trying to do community development and at the same time bring investors in to put forward more community development in a neighborhood. The third provision is to sustain the 30% credit for small projects. So the 30% bump up would be permanent for projects 2.5 million and below. And there is something we call the donut hole, where you would essentially have, a $750,000 credit from 2.5 million all the way up to, 3.5 million or something like that. And that would ramp down that 30% back to 20%. So that would be permanent, and that is to address the challenges in rural areas and non-urban areas. So we think that will be a very beneficial provision, and it'll be permanent. The fourth one is modification of the substantial rehab definition. Right now, you have to spend on the rehab the amount of the building's basis. So they say substantial, but really it's a total rehab. So it's 100% of the building's basis. So if you do not achieve that, you cannot use the credit. We really think that 50% is more reasonable, and that would be considered substantial. So that it would make that change to 50%, and it would allow for more buildings to be rehabbed using the credit, but it would also allow building owners to adapt to a changing economic landscape. Sometimes the current use right now in a new remote world and at different times, a building may need to be repurposed, and this would help buildings do that. And the fifth one is modification to tax-exempt leasing rules. So right now, nonprofits can use the credit, but they have to jump through a lot of hoops in order to do so because they do not assume tax liability. But if they want to use the credit, they have to create something that that does have tax liability. Also, if you think about places and organizations with historic buildings that are nonprofits, they really can't use the credit if they own the building currently. You usually see these entities purchase a building, jump through all these hoops to use the credit and partner with the developer. This would eliminate these troublesome leasing rules and would allow for more nonprofits to use the historic tax credit. And a lot of these nonprofits kind of break into neighborhoods and start the redevelopment and kind of pioneer rehabilitation and revitalization in communities. So it's important that they have the tools they need in order to do historic rehab. And the last one, as I mentioned earlier, is allowing the HTC to be used for historic public school buildings. There are a lot of historic schools across the country, and right now you see communities sell those historic properties to a developer who changes the use of that to where it's no longer a public school. It might be senior housing, it could be a charter school, it could be something else. So this would allow the HTC to be used on public schools that are still in use. So moving to the next slide, what can you do? We are really excited that there is interest to advocate on behalf of the historic tax credit. As Shaw mentioned, this $3.5 trillion bill is going to be trimmed down significantly, and members of Congress are going to be listening to what their constituents are saying is important. There is a lot of provisions in this bill, and we have to make some noise in order to stay in the bill. And so I think the first thing you can do is specifically, as Shaw mentioned, Democratic senators are probably the most key right now. Republicans will not be voting for this bill. There will be no Republican votes, most likely, for this reconciliation package. And the House has already kind of laid out their package, the 3.5 trillion, and will be up to the Senate to trim this down to balance it to the desires of the moderate senators. And so that's going to come down significantly. But I think you can reach out to your members of Congress and first of all, thank them for any previous support of the historic tax credit. We had a big outpouring of support in 2017, and it's likely that they've heard from a lot of us. And then number two is give local examples of HTC projects that would benefit from the enhancements. So it's good to kind of copy and paste some of these provisions in your message. Tell them that the historic tax credit enhancements are in the House bill passed out of committee, and make the request and ask them to support these provisions in the final budget reconciliation bill. And then if you can share the text of the provisions, that's helpful. If you can tell stories of how these provisions would benefit local projects, that's very helpful. If you can create a dialogue with the office, that's very helpful. One way that's easy to take action is to just go to a member's website and it'll say contact the legislator, and then you can choose the issue area of taxes and then lay out your message there. That's an easy way, and they move those messages up the chain to the appropriate staff. Also, if you would like to contact a staffer directly, we are more than happy to help you do that. We can help you find a tax staffer to contact within an office. So we're ready to help. We really want to get this across the finish line. These are the most important changes since 1986, and we see this as a real opportunity for historic rehab across the country.
Thanks, Mike. We have a lot of great questions that are popping up. So we'll move to the Q&A portion of the program, and we'll answer every question that we can in the next 15 minutes or so if they're still coming up. We also want to encourage you to make sure that you are looking and using other resources that might be available. So I just want to make sure that everybody's aware of a recent podcast episode with Meryl Hoopengardner talking all through the credit. And I'm going to chat out the link to that to everybody so that we can all take a listen. NTCIC's president and CEO explaining all of this in great detail and using some of the similar language that we're using here. And also just to share out Main Street America's most recent update with the messaging that we just discussed that Mike just mentioned. So if you want to reference back, you can also find that on our website. We will have additional resources coming soon as well. Oh, I am so sorry. I did that. But we also wanted to just make sure that you had all of our contact information in case you want to reach out to anybody specifically about your outreach. And there were a few questions that have already come in. So I'm going to play moderator and ask these questions to Mike and Shaw, starting from the top. And then I noticed Shaw was also answering some live, but we'll make sure to address everything that was brought to our attention because they are probably questions for everyone. So the first question from Carl that came up was when we're talking about kind of the legislative approach here, why was HTC Go placed in the reconciliation bill and not hard infrastructure? Historic buildings are infrastructure. It's a great question.
That is a great question, and there is a pretty it's a pretty it'll be easy to understand the answer, which is that in order to reach a bipartisan agreement on hard infrastructure, Republicans were concerned that a large tax title in that bill would have resulted in, it would have bogged that down and resulted in efforts to increase corporate tax rates, things like that. And so the strategy on the Democrat side was to have the larger tax title in the Democrat-only reconciliation bill. So that's why we didn't see many tax provisions in that hard infrastructure bill at all. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. Thank you for addressing that, Shaw. Another question, and I'm looking at both. We have questions coming into the Q&A box as well as the chat, so we'll bounce it back and forth between both, kind of in the order that they came in. Diana, and hello, Diana, out in Danville, asked if there was any way to capture how much investment has been made both nationally and by the state using federal HTCs to help, make sure to localize those talking points. And Shaw, I think you responded that you could take a swing at this, and I can share a link too.
Yeah, and Mike, I don't want to leave you out of the fun, so we can alternate these however you want, buddy. But yeah, I think there are a number of resources that Kelly already put on the screen where to find this additional information. But savingplaces.org, and then you go to the Advocacy Resource Center. There are a list of talking points about what to convey about the historic tax credit. Basically that it's a proven tax incentive for both revitalizing community assets and supporting economic development and recovery. There's another question that came in about the amount of investment that we've seen. That is captured in the National Park Service's annual report on the historic tax credit. That's actually 173 billion over the life of the program. And breaking it down on a state-by-state basis, I believe you can also find that in the Park Service report. We can also make sure that we can circulate that after the webinar too. I believe we've got that listed as well.
Yeah, and the National Trust has maps and lists of projects for the last 20 years. So you can send that to your member of Congress and share with them the activity that's happened in your state. And then also it has totals on there of total development generated by the historic tax credit.
Fantastic. Another good question that came in through the chat was wondering how we know whether or not our officials, our senators, have taken positive action on the historic tax credit in the past. When we outreach, should we be thanking them? How do we know whether or not they are supportive in advance?
Sure. So we've had some marker bills out there. Presently in the Congress, a lot of House members have signed on and co-sponsored HR 2294. So that's one way to see if House members have supported these provisions. And then in the Senate, it's a little more recent. The bill was introduced this summer, and that's S 2266. Now, that doesn't mean they haven't been a previous supporter of the historic tax credit. Obviously, Kelly, Shaw, or I could help give you some kind of indication if you were curious. We'd be happy to work with you. But a lot of these members have been supportive, if not presently, than in previous years and when tax reform was being considered in 2017.
Something else, I want to just make sure that it was clarified. Kitty had asked, will the credit still be over a 5-year time period instead of the previous pre-2017, one time credit? And I believe we answered it, but I just want to clarify for everyone about whether or not the provisions would reverse the 2017 changes.
So they would not reverse the changes from 2017. It would still be spread over 5 years. And the reasoning behind that is in developing Historic Tax Credit Growth and Opportunity Act, one of the important aspects of that is that you carry that bill forward so that you are sensitizing members to those priorities. And if you repeat them, you improve the likelihood that they will stick and be acted upon. When the bill was developed, Republican priority was spreading these credits out over time to cut costs. And it was too soon to go back and try to change that so soon after 2017. And since then, we've really had to stick with the primary provisions of HTC Go. Would that be a priority going forward in the future? Yes, I think we'll continue to look to that. But for right now, this moment, we wanted to move on the provisions that members are most familiar with.
Yeah, and I'll just echo the costs of the bill limit us. We have costs with these enhancements, and then if you were to go back to a 1-year credit, that would really skyrocket the costs of it, which is something that would be beneficial. But right now, the scoring of the bill, overall is being reduced.
Thank you both for addressing that concern. We have received some consistent questions about whether or not we should be advocating to Republican senators. And I know, there are different moments at different points in a process where different people will be most influential. Just want to get your perspective on, should folks reach out to Republicans right now, or should they entirely focus on, well, if you only have Republicans in your state, that wouldn't be an option.
No, I think you can, and I think it's beneficial. I would recommend that you ask their support in the context of the bill, the Historic Tax Credit Growth and Opportunity Act, and ask for their co-sponsorship. As I mentioned before, there will likely be no Republicans voting for the reconciliation package. So that would kind of fall on ears that are not listening to that side of that type of encouragement. So ask them to co-sponsor HTC Go. That's Senate Bill 2266 and House Bill 2294. And you can see these bills on congress.gov. If you just want to type in those bill numbers, they'll show up. And if we can get co-sponsors on there, hey, right now we have a Democratic controlled Congress and a White House, and that may not be the case in a few years. So it's important to continue to advocate to these legislators. In regard to the reconciliation package, though, we do want you to reach out to your Democratic members of Congress. But if you do not have Democratic members of Congress to reach out to, it's always helpful to reach out to Republican members and encourage them to co-sponsor the bill.
I would just add, just more to Mike's point about bigger, longer term picture. Our advocacy over all these years has focused on bipartisan support for the historic tax credit and historic preservation. And that's really been a hallmark of our work. Oftentimes, the bill in past Congresses, and even in this one, there's really an even split between Republicans and Democrats' support for this. So while this opportunity right now really is being driven by Democrats, Mike's point is exactly right, that longer term, we want to continue to maintain this idea and the incentive and its impact as a bipartisan supported incentive.
And I'll just say one thing, and really that's the reality of the credit, right? I mean, you have projects all over the country, almost in every single state, almost in every single congressional district. And so, all members of Congress should be aware that of the benefits of the historic tax credit. This particular drill on reconciliation, we're focusing on Democrats, but overall, all members of Congress are important in relation to the bill.
Wonderful. Thank you both for kind of addressing the complexity there and the long-term vision of the improvements. I also would be remiss to mention, because it's been brought to our attention in the Q&A, if you're attending the National Trust for Historic Preservation's Past Forward Conference, we highly encourage you, when you're signing up for the conference or in your options for registration, to check that you want to be involved in the lobby day that is happening in coordination with the conference. We will have scheduled meetings with multiple, with offices in every state. So we have advocacy captains working in your state to set up meetings with your members of Congress so that you can bring these issues to their attention in early November during the time of the conference. If you want more information on that, we'll provide it as follow-up to this to make sure that you have the ability to join us in those meetings. Shaw and Mike have been busy organizing those, as well as Renee Kuhlman, who is clearly on the line reminding us to make sure that we all participate that day. And we absolutely encourage everyone out there to get involved in the lobby day as part of the conference. We had another question here. Can you say anything about how the federal HTCs interact with state level HTCs? And I think that's a great question, just to remind us all that those are really out there as well.
Sure. State historic tax credits are very important to getting projects rehabbed. They drive a lot of the investment into these projects, and they're definitely under consideration when a developer or a building owner considers historic tax credits. There's different types of historic tax credits all over the nation, depending on which state you live in, with the rules and your ability to use them. But they are a very, if you look at the most historic tax credit projects in the country, those states that have the most usually have a state HTC as well that helps drive the investment there.
And I would also note that on the state historic tax credits, you see states experimenting and customizing their state HTCs to address issues that they are most focused on. So you see affordable housing bump ups included in state historic tax credits. You really see that operating as states as laboratories of invention. And so I think if you do state HTC advocacy, that is a key way to ultimately influence federal policy as well in positive ways.
Thank you. Abby noted that there have been no tax credits taken advantage of in her area. She's asking if there's somebody that would be willing to help her put a package together to help her, let her city, county, and others know what they're missing out on. And I'm just, for one, Abby, I don't know where you're located, but I think anybody that's on this call would be happy to help point you to the direction of the resources to make that case. And so I would speak for everybody. Our emails are there if you want to reach out to any of us as follow-up. Even where there hasn't been uses of historic tax credits, you could still be a very able advocate to show how the credit could be impactful to future projects.
And we can also help you connect with maybe someone in your state that does historic rehab and using the historic tax credit, and maybe they would be a good local connection.
We have two other questions in our list here, and we're coming up on the end of our time. So quickly, we have Wendy is a constituent of Senator Manchin's and has the ability to reach out to his team. Would there be anything specific to include? And I think that this is a great question for any advocate that's reaching out to their senator, despite the fact that we know that Senator Manchin has a specific kind of role in the whole process.
Sure. You know, Senator Manchin is very important. He needs to know that these provisions would be helpful to West Virginia. If you can discuss projects that are in the works, projects that need to be rehabbed in the community, how revitalization will happen in your community and what the connection is to historic tax credits, and enhancing these would just make the revitalization easier and more feasible. I think that's the message that Senator Manchin needs to hear. There's a healthy amount of projects in West Virginia and a healthy amount of projects that need to get done. So that's a great message. That would be a great message to Senator Manchin.
I would also take that opportunity to point out that West Virginia did fairly recently enact their own state historic tax credit. So the support from constituents is there, and it is having a big impact. And I think referencing some of the data pre-state historic tax credit and post-state historic tax credit would be helpful for Senator Manchin to see. But we would absolutely encourage and appreciate that outreach to Senator Manchin. He is certainly in the news cycle daily, and that would be an important touch, definitely.
Excellent. Well, Paul also noted, Paul had asked the question about the state historic tax credit, and I'll just note that Paul's other response here was that the challenge is that the state follows the federal tail to determine costs, but then the states always have to have balanced budgets, so it creates the perception that tax credits are too expensive. And I think for us, that maybe the last question that we can address here is, what is there a good response if somebody says that any tax credits, federal tax credits for our purposes today, are too expensive? How do we address that question?
Well, there's the answer we've used for a long time is that at the federal level, we've seen the amount of credits that go out over time actually return investment to the federal government by a ratio of often for every dollar, you see $1.15 to $1.25 come back to Treasury in the form of additional tax revenue when you see some of that economic recovery and growth happening.
Fantastic. So we are at the end of our time today with the program. I do want to remind all attendees that we will have a recording of this available, as well as additional resources as follow-up. And you'll see more resources coming out in the coming couple of days, actually, on this topic, to have more ability for you to reach out and advocate and share the message also with others in your community. Sorry. Lisa, I'm so sorry I missed your question. Is there a process support for a Main Street program to take on a building project under their nonprofit? Lisa, let's talk about that later. I think it's a little bit expansive for us being at the end of our time today. But I'll be certain to follow up with you. But again, there'll be a recording that's available. Any final words, Shaw or Mike, for our advocates?
I would just note we have an October 21st webinar associated with Pass Forward on general advocacy, which will include historic tax credit updates. So that'll be happening at a pretty important time in the process. And to answer a question about timeline, again, I'd stress these next few weeks and note that even if we see the October 31st date slip, decisions are being made right now about where cuts need to be made. And when we finally hear about the number that they've agreed upon, it's probably too late to make those changes. So now, over the next 3 weeks, is really the time to influence where these cuts will be made. So thanks for that question.
Yeah, I would just echo that. If you're going to take action, I would do it now. It's the most important time of the next week or two. As Shaw's saying, they're behind closed doors making these decisions, and members need to assess what's important to their constituents, and they are doing that right now. And the door is closing on the negotiations at some point. So earlier the better, and now's the time to do it.
Well, Mike, Shaw, thank you so much for your time today in explaining every in and out of the historic tax credit. And thank you all in our networks, the combined networks of the National Trust, NTCIC, and Main Street America, for coming here today to have questions answered and to take the next steps on advocacy. If we poll you again next week, I hope that we get 100% response rate to did you reach out to your senators by phone. So please, we encourage you to take that step, and look out for more resources and information forthcoming and follow up to the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.